Hello everyone, my name is Connor Rosenblatt and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of California, Davis. Before starting my PhD, I worked at Virginia Tech as a research technician for Dr. Ashley Dayer, who is an assistant professor of human dimensions in the Department of Fish and Wildlife Conservation. Today, I'm here to present work that myself and Dr. Dayer did along with several other collaborators on the role of recreation specialization to explain citizen science contribution patterns. So imagine the following scenario. You're out on a casual walk, you pass a marsh, and you see these ducks. What do? Do you simply take a quick glance and admire their coloration? Do you make a mental note of the number of different species? Or do you pull out your phone and create an eBird list? As I'm sure you all know, eBird is this magnificent citizen science project managed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. In fact, eBird is the world's largest biodiversity citizen science project. eBird is useful both for birders and scientists. For birders, they have access to data exploration features that can enhance the birding experience, such as the ability to locate hotspots nearby or to find certain target birds. Scientists are able to use the data submitted to eBird for a variety of purposes, such as creating seasonal abundance maps for species as you see on the right. Yet, even for a citizen science project like eBird with hundreds of thousands of users, not everyone uses eBird equally. In fact, most of the data to eBird is actually submitted by a relatively small number of users, as you can see in this image on the left, where we have this single user at the top submitting the vast majority of the checklists from a specific region. In fact, most users tend to only submit a few checklists and then never submit one again. So seeing a trend like this may bring up several questions. Why do some birders contribute frequently and not others? How skilled are the birders submitting most of the checklists? And are there some highly skilled birders who don't use eBird, and why not? And this contribution pattern that we see is not unique to eBird. There is a widespread lack of sustained contribution across many other citizen science projects, whereas most projects fail to retain participants over the long term, and most participants typically engage only a few times before dropping out of the project. So this brings up the question of how can we better understand these trends in contribution rates? A theoretical framework that could potentially explain contribution rates is recreation specialization, or RecSpec as you'll hear me refer to it as. So RecSpec is a theory first proposed by Hobbs and Bryan in 1979, and it describes how recreationists progress in their involvement in an activity such as birders. So this allows recreationists to be classified along a continuum from low to high specialization. For example, with recreationists who have low specialization levels, devoting relatively low amounts of time and money into an activity and not investing a lot in it, whereas recreationists at the high end of the spectrum, they devote a lot of time and money into their recreational activity, and it takes up a great portion of their life. And so while RecSpec has been used to describe birders in a variety of contexts, it has never been applied in the context of citizen science. And when explaining RecSpec, there are three dimensions of the construct to know about, which I will briefly explain in the next few slides. So the first dimension is the affective dimension, or the psychological attachment to the activity. And this includes things like how much of your life is organized around your recreational activity. The next is the behavioral dimension, which describes how often a person has been engaged in an activity. It also describes the way in which a person engages in activity. So in the context of birding, this would be how often do you take birding trips? Do you have specialized equipment such as spotting scopes? And then finally, there's the cognitive dimensions, which is the knowledge and skill about an activity a person has. So intertwined with RecSpec are motivations for engaging in outdoor recreation. These can include appreciation motivations, which are motivations related to performing the activity to receive mental well-being, and achievement motivations, which is performing the activity to realize a specific goal. And so to assess whether RecSpec could explain variation in contribution rates among eBird participants, we had two main objectives. The first was to create groups of eBird users based on contribution levels, and the second was to compare specialization dimensions and motivations among the different eBird contribution groups. So the data we had came from a survey designed by the North American Waterfowl Management Plan's Human Dimensions Working Group. And the goal of this survey was to understand the involvement and preferences of birders in the US and Canada. And so just to be clear, this survey asked respondents about their behaviors related to birding, not specifically using eBird. So that will be something to just keep in mind throughout this presentation. And then to segment users into distinct groups based on how much they contributed to eBird, we used k-means cluster analysis to segment these users. And we segmented them according to several variables related to eBird behavior. We had the total number of checklists submitted, the number of unique birding locations, the number of unique counties birded in, and the total number of days spent birding. And initial clustering produced a very unequal distribution in groups. This was largely driven by the fact that almost 20% of users in our sample submitted exactly one checklist. So we manually segmented this group into their own cluster and then performed k-means clustering on the remaining participants who had submitted more than one checklist. And then we also used k-means clustering to group respondents into different specialization classes. And we performed this clustering on 10 survey items to capture the 3 dimensions of specialization. So as you can see here, for the affective dimension, this included survey questions like asking respondents how much they agree or disagree with a statement that birdwatching has a central role in their life. For behavioral, about how many times in the past 12 months have you taken trips from home to birdwatch? And then for the cognitive dimension, asking questions like asking respondents to self-rate their own ability to observe and identify birds. Similarly, for motivations, we use 7 survey items to construct the 2 classes of motivations, achievement and appreciation. Appreciation motivations included statements like being in nature is an important part of birding, and achievement motivations included things like getting a chance to add a new bird to my life list is important. For analytic methods, we compared mean scores for specialization dimensions and motivations among the eBird contribution groups using one-way Kruskal-Wallis tests. And because the sample size was very large, as you'll see in a minute, we focus on effect size rather than p-values to highlight differences in mean scores. And we considered this eta square value greater than 0.14 to indicate a large effect size. So let's dive into the results. So first, I'm going to talk about the different eBird groups that emerged when segmenting users according to k-means. So as you can see in the first column, we have 4 different groups of participants. We have the non-retained, the occasional, the moderate, and the active. And as you can see with columns 3 through 6, as you move from non-retained to active, the numbers increase, indicating that active users are submitting more checklists, birding in more different locations, and spending more days birding compared to non-retained users. All groups are roughly the same size with the exception of the occasional group, which is over twice as large as the others. So now we're going to talk about the measures of recreation specialization. So this is across all users, not the eBird classes. So RecSpec clustering produced 3 specialization classes of birders. So you can see at the top there are generalists, intermediates, and specialists. And in the first column, you can see all 3 dimensions of specialization. And as you move from generalist to specialist, these scores all increase. So this indicates, for example, like with the behavioral dimension, that specialists are more behaviorally invested in birders than intermediates, who are more behaviorally invested than generalists. Same thing with affective and cognitive. And as you can see with the eta squared value, these are all very large, indicating large effect sizes for all dimensions of recreation specialization. So now we get into the fun part. Now we're going to look at scores of the different RecSpec dimensions and motivations across the eBird groups. So let's start with the affective dimension. So here you can see that there is an increasing trend from non-retained to active eBird users. So this means that active contributors to eBird, they have more of a psychological attachment to birding than do the non-retained eBird users. And this has a large effect size, albeit just barely over the 0.14 threshold. For behavioral dimension, we see the same thing with a much larger effect size. So again, indicating that active eBird users are more behaviorally invested in birding as a recreational activity than our non-retained eBird users. For the cognitive dimension, we see a similar pattern where active eBird contributors have the highest score for the cognitive dimension, whereas non-retained have the lowest, and this also has a large effect size. And then we get into motivations and we see something a little different. So for appreciation motivations, there is still an increasing trend, but you'll notice that the difference in scores between the groups are relatively small, and the effect size is 0.05, indicating that there's a small effect size of appreciation motivations. And with achievement motivations, we're back to seeing a large difference where active eBird contributors have higher levels of achievement motivations than do non-retained eBird contributors. And so this is just a figure to illustrate the breakdown of individuals in each specialization class in each eBird contribution. So if you look all the way at the right among active eBird contributors, we see that 69% of those active eBird contributors are classified as specialist birders, whereas only 3% are classified as generalist birders. And if you look at the non-retained eBird contribution group, you'll see that that group is largely made up of generalist and intermediate birders, with specialist birders comprising only about 11% of the group. So while this does show that most specialist birders, who are the most skilled birders and would contribute the highest quality data, they are the ones who contribute most frequently to eBird. Yet despite this, there is still a sizable percentage of highly skilled specialized birders who don't contribute to eBird. I mean, they make up 11% of the non-retained group, so that's roughly 500 individuals in this sample, which isn't non-trivial by any means. So to discuss our results, in general, they suggest that the birders who are most specialized do contribute the most data to eBird, as we saw in the graph on the previous slide. And in general, the behavioral dimension was the most distinguishing feature, whereas participants in the active group take the most trips away from home and own the most specialized equipment, such as scopes. And this suggests that the difference in behavioral dimension is the most distinguishing feature of the eBird contribution groups. And this isn't too surprising, given that eBird has unique data exploration features, such as rare bird alerts for specific regions, and the ability to search regions to see what birds have been found. So this is most likely to appeal to birders that are interested in traveling to see new birds. And switching over to motivations, we saw that the effect size was very small for appreciation motivations. So this means that everyone enjoyed the natural beauty of birding. For non-retained birders, this may suggest that although the birds they see may not be highly important to them, they really do enjoy being out in nature while birding, and this is important to them. So therefore, working to highlight the natural beauty of birding may be a great way to appeal to these non-retained contributors, who often may look to pair birding with other activities. While appealing to beauty for the non-retained birders, it also certainly still appeals to the active contributors. So appealing more to beauty could be a great way to draw in these non-retained contributors who don't use eBird frequently. And as any serious birder knows, sometimes the best birding spots aren't necessarily the most beautiful, as you can see in this comparison between two eBird hotspots located in Western Virginia. While the Roanoke sewage treatment plant certainly has a lot of species that you could see there, only the super serious birders would want to spend time there, whereas with Cascade Falls, even though there's only been about 60 species recorded there, I think anyone, regardless of their interest in birding, would certainly love to spend time at a beautiful natural feature such as this. And then, unlike appreciation motivations, we found a large effect size for achievement motivations, with active contributors being the ones most motivated by competition. And so that given that eBird promotes friendly competition through features such as rankings, it's not surprising that active contributors are most motivated by achievement. And while this gamification, as it's called, can sometimes be beneficial to recruiting participants, it can sometimes deter others from contributing. So citizen science projects may be able to encourage sustained contribution by striking a fine balance between appealing to both achievement and appreciation motivations. And yeah, as I said, gamification can be a deterrent to some. And so just a few quick future directions. So as I mentioned, one limitation is that we did not directly ask respondents about their motivations for using eBird specifically, and instead we only have information about their motivations for birding more generally. So asking users specifically about their reasons for eBirding is needed to strengthen our findings. And a future study should also seek to obtain information on non-participants. So while we had non-retained participants who only submitted a single checklist and are likely similar to those who don't have an eBird account at all, there still may be some important differences and further investigation is needed. And so the next time you walk past these ducks, what will you do? Well, if you're a birder who is motivated mostly by appreciation, you will likely just stop and admire these birds for a few minutes. But if you're a competitive birder motivated by achievement, you'll pull out your phone and submit an eBird checklist for these observations, because that redhead is a new bird on your county year list. With that, I would like to thank all the organizations that helped in some way with some component of this project. There were a lot of them, as you can see. And then I would like to thank all of you for being here today and for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions about any of the material, my email address is on the slide, so feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.